we've been doing a series of sermons out of a study that some of us are doing on Sunday evenings called Gospel-Shaped Living. And it's given us an opportunity to look at ourselves, but even more so to look at the church and what God is calling the church to be in this world. And especially, I hope you've noticed there's some contrast to what we are called to be versus the state of the world. The world is dark, and we are called to be light in that darkness. Or then we looked at the world as a divided world and broken up, and we're called to be one church, a united church of God's people in the midst of that world, in contrast to that. And then last week, the selfish world out there, and we're called to be servants in that selfish world. A selfish world that is driven by our selfishness because of our sin, and we are called then as Christians and as the church to live in the model of Jesus, who called us to deny ourselves and to follow Him, and to take up the cross and follow Him, and to serve in humble service. Well, today there's going to be a contrast between a stingy world and our call to be a generous people. And so to reflect on that, I wanted to turn to our scripture, which is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And I want to read verses 1 through 9. Let's pray. Father, be among us now by your Spirit to quicken our hearts and our minds to hear what you have to say, that we might more faithfully serve and follow you, transformed by your word. In Jesus' name. So let's stand together in honor of God's word as we now read 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Listen to the word of God. And now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. And they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then to us, in keeping with God's will. So we urge Titus, as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I'm not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Friends, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Be seated. So if you were here last week, I touched on that a little bit, that we live in a world that is infected by sin and selfishness that traces itself all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden, who were tempted by the serpent, tempted by devil to try to elevate themselves and make themselves more than what they were, and try to be more like God. And so they took of the fruit in disobedience to God, and out of that disobedience, sin came in and has infected us. And that sin just shapes everything in the world around us. And think of those descriptions of the world around us that we've had over the last few weeks. The darkness of the world. You see, sin is what blocks the light of God from shining into the world, and so the world is dark because of that. Or sin is what gets us to focus on ourselves and what I am different from somebody else, and so then we look at those differences and then we start making walls of distinction rather than being together in that. Or sin is what infects us to say, it's mine. From the time of children, right? We talked about that last week, mine, and we have that desire to grab and to hold on to things and to get more and more for ourselves without thinking of others so much. And selfishness also defines the description of the world that we're looking at today. It's a stingy world. Interesting word, stingy, right? You look it up in the dictionary, and the definition in the dictionary is reluctant to give or spend, or not generous. Now, it's that idea then of holding so tightly, and this goes beyond what those of us who have Scottish heritage might refer to as being frugal. I like that term for us. So, to be careful. But it's really, stinginess is an attitude of the heart that says that reluctance or that unwillingness to even give a little, but, just wanting to hold on to everything in that way, to even consider giving. And so if we want to talk about that stinginess then, and that reluctance, probably the most obvious way and the measurable way to do that is to talk about it in terms of money and what we do with money in our lives. There are other areas certainly that we can talk about giving, and I'll touch on that too. But start off with that one. Now, I think a lot of times we're kind of reluctant in the church to talk about money for various reasons, and we shared some of this the other evening. In some ways it's a very personal matter between us and God. It's not anybody else's business. Or sometimes we're reluctant to talk about it because we may be embarrassed by the level of our giving, and we really don't want others to know. Or some people may be reluctant to talk about it because they don't want to come across as boasting or making themselves look good by what they give. Or others think that we shouldn't talk about money in the church because it's a ploy for the pastor or the priest or whoever to get more money so that there's more money for his pockets and those kinds of things. And certainly there are some aspects in church culture where it's taboo, if you will, to talk about money. But then we live in a culture that talks about all kinds of things anymore, and more openly. You go on Facebook and it's amazing some of the personal stuff that people are willing to talk about. And sometimes the only way that they'll talk about money is on the basis of how much they have or what great things they're spending it on and all that. And we like to think that we are that we're doing okay. Is she all right? Yeah. Okay. All right. And we like to think though that we live in a culture as Americans that is pretty good about being generous. Well, in some senses, there's some truth to that, but I came across a study that has been done by an organization called the Charities Aid Foundation that has spent time over years looking at generosity, if you will, in over 130 countries and kind of ranking those. And not just in terms of money, but also, and this is a way of when we talk about generosity, of what we do with our time, and what our attitudes are to helping and giving even to strangers and people that we really don't know. And so we here in so-called Christian America, we're number 5 in the 2017 study that was done. Number 1, Buddhist Myanmar. Number 2, Muslim Indonesia. And then comes Kenya and New Zealand, and then us at number 5. Now, when they took the 5 years before that and averaged those, we did come in number 2 on an average there as Americans. Still after Myanmar, you know where Myanmar is. It used to be called Burma, all right? And that's still number 1. At least we were number 2 there, but the fact that by 2017 we're number 5 means that we may be kind of dropping down in some way. 56% of Americans surveyed in this study gave in some way. Some of those more towards giving of their time, whatever. On the financial piece of it, it was right there. 56% of Americans give in some way to something else. In Myanmar, and part of this is a Buddhist thing, of alms for the poor, 91% of Buddhists in Myanmar are giving in some way. So we might say, well, at least we're not 125th on the list or something like that. I don't know if that makes us feel any better. But then when we look at what we really have in this country and the culture that we have, the richest country in the world, and how we do go about giving, the average giving is at 1% of what people give. Among Christians, a little bit better, somewhere between 2 and 3% is the average among Christians, but still far short of the biblical tithe on that too, right? I guess the question for us is, all right, how generous are we? How does that hit us? And, are we more like the stingy culture or cultures around us, or are we being shaped by the gospel and living generously? And maybe the way to start is to think about our motivations for being generous and to give. And there are a whole variety of reasons that people might give for why they're generous, and especially if we're talking about money. Some give out of a sense of guilt. Guilt is a great motivator in life, isn't it? And so, I'm going to feel guilty if I don't help out in some way. Others might give because of the recognition that comes with it. Think of, like colleges and universities and other institutions like that have a building named after the big donor, right? You get your name on the building. But sometimes some of that even creeps into the church with plaques on different things that have been given, and there's some recognition with that. Some give it for that. Some give out of a sense of legalism, that I've got to comply with, how to do things and live life in that way. Others may give because they think it's a way to curry some kind of favor with God. That, if I can give, then maybe God will look at me and smile on me and overlook those bad things that I do. And if I give even more, well, then those will really go away. Maybe He'll even let me into heaven because I've been so generous in that way. Others may give because of tax deduction. Now, up until a couple of years ago, there are some ways that would help. And with the changes in the tax law over the last couple of years and a huge increase in the standard deduction, that's pretty much wiped out for most people, and I wonder how that is going to impact people and incentive to give. Others may give just because they expect to get something in return. That nice meal that comes at the fundraising dinner. Or at least a chance to win the raffle and what's in that raffle. Or even just to get a thank you note or something like that. Why do we give? What's behind that? What's our motivation? So looking at our text today, the story of the Macedonians and what they did, and let's look at that. Now, we need to have some of the context of what Paul is writing about here. In the first century, we know that the church started in Jerusalem. Pentecost, Peter preaching, and the growth of the church, and it was there in Jerusalem. But the disciples also took very seriously what some of Jesus' last words to them, to go and to preach the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. And so they had taken that on, and the church had spread. But over time, the church in Jerusalem found itself on hard economic times. And this wasn't so much in terms of, the church was there and they couldn't pay their mortgage or the light bill or the pastor's salary or those kinds of things, because they didn't have all of those things. But it was just a body of people who found themselves living in deep poverty, and there was no government safety net or anything like that. And so there was just that need on the part of those Christians to survive. And there were churches in other parts of the Roman Empire who were doing better. And why not honor and remember that church of Jerusalem, that body of believers, where it had all begun? It just seemed only the right thing to do. And so Paul had set about to take up a collection from the churches in the empire to send to the Christians in Jerusalem. And so the Macedonian church, or it looks like there were apparently a number of churches in that region. And that region, Macedonia, is kind of a little bit above Greece, the Balkan Mountains, in that part of the world. They had heard of what was going on and Paul taking this collection, and they responded. Now, they're described in this text as being they weren't rich people at all. They out of their extreme poverty, they did. And they were undergoing some kind of a severe test of affliction. We don't know what that was. But that was their setting in there. And yet, out of that, they wanted to give, and to give generously. And they responded. In fact, they even begged for the opportunity to be able to share in this collection. And they gave, we're told, according to their means, and even beyond according to their means. What was it behind their desire to give? Was it to make a name for themselves? So they could get in the Bible? Was it to somehow buy favor with God or something like that? Or was it maybe to put the Jerusalem church in their debt so that, if the tables were turned, well, then they could go, how about us? It's not that at all. Paul says, first and foremost, they gave to the Lord. They had God at the top. They were completely sold out to God. And they remembered what God had done for them. And the example that Paul writes of, that Jesus is the one who gave up his riches and took on the poverty of human existence to be one of us, so that we might know God's mercy and grace and have his peace. And the Macedonians understood that. They knew what God had done for them and the generosity of God, and so they wanted to do God's will and to help and to serve others and give them. And maybe that's where we need to start. How do we see ourselves, first and foremost, in relation to God? And really grasp what God has done for us. You know, there's nothing that we could do to add to God's being, his holiness, his power, or anything like that. He is, I talked about that Friday afternoon at our Presbyterian meeting. God is above all, he's holy. Even beyond any kind of relationship with us. And God has given to us without any expectation of return. Because whatever we might give back to him isn't going to change God. Isn't going to change his character or his being or anything like that. And yet he gave to us out of his generous grace, and he gave us his Son so that we could then be forgiven and have life and the promise of life. And I wonder sometimes if we sort of fall into the trap of thinking that, well, God's going to be beholden to us then if we give back and if we are good and if we are obedient and do good things and all of that. We can't earn God's favor at all. The sin that we have so infects us and is such an offense to God that he just can't have anything to do with that. And yet he puts that aside, looking through the lens of seeing Jesus instead. And so then gives us his grace. What a gift. And if we can see that and understand that, then how do we extend that beyond ourselves? Do we then, unlike God, try to put strings on what we might give? Oh, we'll give to the deserving poor, as though there's a distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Or we're going to give as long as there's some kind of a return in it for us, even if it's just something as simple as God's blessing. Is that what we're in it for, or are we just willing to give? And certainly there is that call to be responsible in how we do that. But there's also that idea, too, with God of the total abandonment of giving. Think of Jesus dying on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's almost as though God is just totally given to that extent that Jesus even felt abandoned. I wonder if we could ever come to that point. Now, the Bible has some teaching and some guidelines for how we might live that out and put that into practice. And the Bible clearly teaches, I believe, of giving that tithe, which is a 10% tithe. I've heard people say, well, I tithe 5%. No, you don't. That's really what the Bible is talking about in that way. And there are all kinds of conversations that we can have about that. The Bible talks about offerings on top of that. And then sometimes we get into, well, is that on the net or the gross? Is that to the church or to other organizations? Those are conversations for another time, too. But the point is, too, that we can't let that become a legalistic thing, to think that, by doing this, we're somehow going to earn God's favor and earn God's blessings or anything like that. But I see so much of what God teaches us in that area as a discipline tool to teach us. And sometimes, when we learn lessons early on, it's not easy. Whatever that might be. Memorizing the multiplication tables. Boy, that just... if you remember having to do that, it's just not fun at all. But after a while, you do it, and it just starts flowing, right? And it just becomes a habit, and so it is with that giving. It may be difficult at first, and really stretches, but after a while, it can just become a habit, if you will, and it becomes a natural, and it becomes a thing of joy. The Macedonians gave with great joy to this. We are called to a generous response to God's generous grace that He has poured out upon us and to give as the Macedonians did. And that goes beyond just the money. In that study I talked about earlier, we measured not just the giving of money, but also how we give of our time to others. And how we even give to strangers, people we may never encounter again. What is it that you have that you can be generous with, especially in this stingy world? You know, I came across, there's a psalm that speaks of some of that generosity and what God sees. I want to read some of these words from Psalm 112. Praise the Lord. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who finds great delight in His commands. His children will be mighty in the land, the generation of the upright will be blessed. Wealth and riches are in his house, and his righteousness endures forever. Even in darkness, light dawns for the upright, for the gracious and compassionate and righteous man. Good will come to him who is generous and lends freely, and who conducts his affairs with justice. Surely he will never be shaken, a righteous man will be remembered forever. He will have no fear of bad news. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. His heart is secure, he will have no fear. In the end, he will look in triumph on his foes. He has scattered abroad his gifts to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. His horn will be lifted high in honor. What a description. What could that be said about us, about you, and about me? And then it carries over, because we're talking individually, yes, but we're talking about the church too, and how the church could be generous in this stingy world. But it starts with us, and then it grows into the church to do that. And maybe, if you go back and look, take your bulletin home with you, that prayer of confession about ways we're going to go so up and give a little bit and hold back. And think of how the words of that prayer might be touching you. You know, you think about how that gets expressed in a generous way in a body of believers. Some of us are reading through the Bible again this year, and this week we're in Exodus and all the descriptions about the building of the tabernacle and all the furnishings and all that went into that. And so they went in and took a collection from the people to, collect all those goods. And the people gave generously. In fact, so much so in Exodus 36, it's like, stop! We got too much! We got too much. Tell them to stop. Boy, what would ever happen if we... Can you imagine that happening in the church today? I don't know. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. But may God find us to be generous people in the midst of the stingy world. Let's pray. Father, we do give you thanks for your generosity to us in so many ways. Above all, that gift of grace that you've given to us in Jesus, who for our sakes gave up his riches and became poor. Father, may we as his followers live out that kind of generosity, that we would give freely, so that you would be honored and that people would know the generous grace that you pour out upon them as well. We pray this in Jesus' name. And all God's people